So during the sprint review, I'm going to talk about the various user stories that we accomplished during sprint 2 and walk through the different acceptance criteria associated with those user stories to explain whether or not we met them. Spoiler alert, we met all of the acceptance criteria for all of the user stories, but I'll still walk through it one by one just to show you everything that you can do. So the first user story was manage recovered foods. And there is a multitude of different acceptance criteria associated with this user story. The three biggest being that they needed to be able to add, update, or delete a recovered food entry. Now, obviously, most of the time they will not be needing to add a recovered food entry directly from here. That'll be done by volunteers through the community page. But if for any reason they need to, they can do it here by clicking the new button, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. And if for any reason a volunteer via the community page enters in an improper recovered food entry, the staff will be able to go in and select that entry. And by clicking either edit or delete, they can edit or delete it to make sure that it reflects the accurate information. And then the other big acceptance criteria here was that we wanted to make sure it was populated with mock data. So as you can see, we have a number of different fake recovered food entries in here, and this was necessary to test a few different formulas that I'll talk about in a second, and this is also necessary to test our reports, which I will also go into further detail later. There was a couple of different acceptance criteria associated with adding a recovered food entry, and as I said, more often than not, they will not be adding a recovered food entry from the screen, but we set up a couple of different formulas and validation rules that will serve as the basis for the community page later on, and I just want to demonstrate those now. So first of all, they'll have to select the donor that it came from. So you can do this by selecting from the donor lookup window. This will be a little bit different on the community page, but they can select the donor. So let's say food bank. Now we have this field that's other donor name, and this is the field where if the donor is other, we would put the actual name of the donor here. Because the donor is not other, we don't want this filled in. But let's say a volunteer got confused and did try to fill it in, and they wanted food bank, so they type food bank there. Now we'll put in the date of the entry, we'll select the food types, let's say meat, and then we'll enter the weight in pounds. If I try to save this, you'll notice there's an error. Please leave this field blank or select other as a donor name. Because we want this to only be filled in if the donor name is other, we set this validation rule in place to make sure they can't fill in this field unless this is selected to other. So let me change this here and select other as our donor name. So clear that, select other. Now let's say I were to select other, but then I were to forget to fill out this other donor name field and I tried to save it. Again, we get an error because now this needs to be filled out. So it says, please enter the name of the other donor or select a donor name from the provided list. So I would have to fill this out and say, maybe it just came from an individual. So now I will be able to save this field. There's another important thing to note here, and that has to do with the food type. So as you noticed, there was no food category field that we filled out. But because I made the food type meats, food category defaulted to raw. Now let's see what were to happen if I change this to bread and bakery and I saved that. Suddenly, food category is prepared. So as you can see, this is a calculated field that we created, and it's based off of the food type, and it automatically updates based on this. If I were to change it, if I were to edit this field, oh, it's not letting me edit, and change it to non-food and save that, we would see, again, food category is now other. So with all of that said, that has accomplished all of our acceptance criteria for managed recovered food. We also went ahead and just made well, this is the managed distributed food, but it's essentially the same, a user guide to how to manage the recovered food entity, essentially, how to go in, add, edit, update. And while they won't really need to be working with this object directly so much, this will just be useful to have in case they do need to go in and work with it. So that was our first user story. Our second user story was then to generate the recovered food reports. And there were two different user stories associated with that use case because there were two different reports that we needed to generate. So we can see those reports by going to this tab up here under reports. And the two for recovered food, there are two different reports. There was the food category report and the comprehensive food recovery report. So let's start by looking at the comprehensive food recovery report. So this is not as pretty as we would like it to be yet, but it does have all of the necessary functionality. Up here, they can filter by date, and they can say when they want the date range to be. And then it'll show all of the recovered food entries categorized by donor and then subcategorized by prepared and raw. And it shows subtotals for each of those fields. So it shows subtotal for Athens Farmers Market, and then subtotal for prepared and subtotal for raw. And then at the bottom, we see the grand total. So that met all of the acceptance criteria for that report. And the other recovered food report was the food category report. And as you can see here, it's very similar, but it's just organized a little bit differently. Now it's organized between other, prepared, and raw, which are the three different possible food category options. And within that, we see the various entities and their food types and the totals associated with each of those totals. So, and then the grand total at the bottom as well. So that's the food category report, which also met all of our acceptance criteria. And the final bit of acceptance criteria for that was to create an instruction manual, and we wanted the instruction manual to cover three things: how to access the report, how to use the report, and then how to print the report. So the access report just talks about where you need to go and where you need to click to find the report. And then the reading the recovered food report explains, basically, for this part, we wanted to make sure it was clear that the subtotals are at the top rather than the bottom in the examples that were given to us, which is just a feature of Salesforce. So we explained that and explained where all the subtotals can be found, as well as how to filter by date. And then printing, we just show them where they can go ahead and print the report, which we know is important to them. So that covers all of the acceptance criteria for the recovered food reports use case. So the next two use cases are basically very similar to what I just discussed, and in fact are a little bit simpler, so I won't go into as much detail. But that was, the first one is the managed distributed foods user story. And again, very similar to the managed recovered foods user story, they need to be able to add a new user story or edit or delete an existing user story. And as you can see, we have also populated this with mock data to use. If they go ahead and add a new distributed food record, similar here where they have a destination name that they can select, and if that destination name is other, that they must fill out the other destination name field. But if it's anything other than other, they can't fill out the other destination name field. So the exact same validation rule that we saw under recovered foods. There is no type or category for this object, so that was not a concern here. So, as you can see, we just created a new distributed food. And as I mentioned before, we also created a guide on how to go ahead and use that, or how to add, update, or delete a distributed food record. So that was all the acceptance criteria for that user story, and that was all met. So for our final user story, that was the generate distributed foods report. And this was just one single report that we created. And it is, you can access it in the same place under reports. And this is going to be the distributed food report. And as you can see, it is subtotaled by the various destinations here, and you can see the subtotal per destination as well as the grand total of all the records. And as with the last report, they are able to filter by date, and they're also able to print. And again, we created a similar user guide for using this distributed food report that walks through how you can access it, how you can read it, and how to print it. So that should be very simple for them to do. So again, that was all the acceptance criteria for the Generate Distributed Food report use case. And so all of those use cases were completed to the definition of done, and we're ready to move on to the next sprint. As for our sprint goal with this sprint, basically our goal with this sprint was to try to actually get a little bit ahead and start doing a little bit of research on the community pages, because we knew that report generation was actually going to end up being fairly simple compared to community pages, and we were indeed able to get a little bit ahead. And even though our learn how to use community pages task is not until the next sprint, we did indeed start doing some research on that. So we were able to accomplish that sprint goal. So we feel very confident in our ability to move forward and accomplish our next sprint according to plan. Thank you.